thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be back here. I haven't been here in a while, and it's a delight to see you in your new building and growing so much and so on. I am indeed here in Israel for the year until July, so I would be delighted to have people to talk to. So get in touch if you have anything to tell me about. What I hoped I'd talk about today is sort of a line of work we've been doing for a while. Again, my background is in computer science. I'm kind of looking into computer science for ways of thinking about problems that the brain solves, and in particular the problem of trial and error decision making. And the sort of main point I think that arises is that, or that I'd like to try to convince you of, is that in complicated problems, like deciding what to do in a complex task by trial and error, the problems are complex enough that you must rely on approximations and tricks and so on. And so what you end up choosing, to a great extent, depends on how it is that you sort of trick, what approximations you take under the problem of solving what to choose to compute your decision variable. So for instance, if there are many possible options, which ones you actually consider and which ones you neglect are going to have a huge impact on what you actually choose. And so I thought I'd tell you today about a sort of line of work we've been working on for a while, using this kind of thinking to approach questions of sort of deliberation versus habits or slips of action or automaticity. When do people and animals do each of these things, and what does it computationally mean that they do so? And then talk a bit about how that helps us think about disorders in the brain, especially involving compulsion, and newer work on how to think about the neural basis of this sort of deliberation. Okay, so the setting computationally that I've thought a lot about is sequential decision tasks. And I think most real-world problems have this property that is not simply what you do immediately that matters, but the consequence of actions play out over time, and they're contingent on other actions that follow. So I jump off here, it's not just whether or not I fall on the fire in this video game. I have to jump over the snake and get the whatever else is here, gems and so on. And so there's a long and contingent mapping from what I do to what it's good for. And that's modeled by a class of tasks known as sequential decision tasks, or Markov decision processes, for instance, that have been studied a lot in computer science. And again, the sort of key property of whether it's an abstract task or a computer game or what, is this separation, the delay of the consequences of actions. Conversely, if you're trying to learn the thing that typically we try to optimize in this, the long-term value of taking some action in some state, some situation, it's going to be a sum of future rewards down the line through the rest of the game. Implicit in that are these delayed contingencies, and figuring those out, the so-called temporal credit assignment problem, poses a lot of difficulties in estimating this quantity and using it to decide what to do. And computer scientists have posed a lot of solutions to this problem. And there's a classic one called model-based learning. Goes back to sort of early checkers players and so on in the 50s, I think, to the sort of dawn of artificial intelligence. Is simply to observe that if I define this as the quantity I want to optimize, the sum of future rewards over trajectories through the game, whether it's a chess game or a video game, then one way to do that is sort of to know these conditional distributions. What rewards do I get in different states of the game, like board states or states of the video game? What's the probability that I'll move from one to the next given particular sort of local actions? So these are sort of local quantities, and I can just string them together to iteratively compute this sum by a sort of mental simulation, right? Sort of think through different paths through the game, add up the rewards, figure out what a particular candidate action is worth, and then do that again and again. And of course, it's laborious, but at least it's sort of well-defined. One reason this idea has been mentioned in computer science is that, or in neuroscience, is that there's been a sort of suggestive idea that this might be subserved in the brain, which I'll come back to later, by the firing of place cells in hippocampus. So hippocampal place cells, of course, famously fire where rats are or think they are, usually. But under other circumstances, you can decode from the rat's hippocampus, from place cells, a a representation of location and see that it runs to places where the animal isn't. So famously, for instance, Pfeiffer and Foster showed these representations running ahead of an animal. So this is sort of grid viewed from above, and he's sitting here doing nothing. It's like 100 milliseconds. And the decode runs ahead to the goal where he's trying to go, and then the animal runs there. And so this is very suggestive. This is, by itself doesn't show a lot, but this is suggestive that this is a sort of readout in the brain of this kind of mental simulation that's also inherent in this sort of equation of thinking through the series of future states of the world so as to figure out whether it's worth doing or something like that. So this is at least a sort of neural connection to this that we'll come back to. Now this is very laborious, as I said, and so another sort of extreme way people have thought about solving this problem is by a sort of memoizing or caching. That is to say, instead of learning all the components of this sum individually and doing a lot of computation to put them together, just try to learn the long-run value of taking a particular action in a particular state and save that, right? So to save the outcome of all that computation, store the endpoint. And this is the way a lot of computer science algorithms work since the 80s in so-called model-free reinforcement learning or temporal difference learning. And many of the famous, like the Atari game player that DeepMind did recently works this way. And it also, it turns out in neuroscience, corresponds to what was sort of the predominant theory when we first started thinking about this of the dopamine system and its role in learned behavior, right? So famously, according to from Schultz and Pierre and so on, dopamine neurons fire with a prediction error signal or carrying a signal that correlates with a prediction error signal. The details of that signal make it appropriate for learning these long-run values Q as though it's a brain mechanism for potentially for solving these kind of long-term sequential decision problems by a model-free algorithm. That is one that doesn't learn by simulation, thinking through the steps of the algorithm, but instead learns directly at the endpoint of that computation. So those are two ways of approaching this problem, although there are many others, of course, but there's sort of two representative endpoints. And they also correspond to, I think, pretty well to a set of ideas that have been around in psychology for a long time. So going back more than 100 years now, Tolman tried to determine whether animals were using what we would think of as a model-based strategy, whether they really had a representation of the sort of contingencies of, in this case, a spatial maze in their head, and were using it to make choices. And the way he did it was using these sort of canonical designs that taught animals different things in different phases and forced them to sort of put them together in a way that he thought would be indicative of building and using a model. So in a task of latent learning, the rat would be invited to explore a maze without any rewards in it at first. And he could, in principle, learn the layout of the maze. And then following that, he could be taught separately. You could drop him at the end and show him that's where the reward is. There's cheese there now or whatever. And then you can put him back at the beginning and ask, does he know where to go, right? And the insight of these experiments, or the sort of trick behind these experiments, is making the right choice of turning left here in phase 3 requires putting together information learned here about the layout of the maze and separately learned here about the position of the rewards. And model-free learning, which tries to learn the long-run values of taking actions kind of directly from their consequences and behavior, is sort of fooled by this because he never actually turns left and gets the cheese. In the training, he has to derive that information by combining these things. And so it doesn't work with sort of standard model-free reinforcement learning, but in fact, even rats can solve this problem at least sometimes. And the standard story, going back to Tolman, about how rats do this, is in the first phase, they really do learn a kind of map of the maze. In the second phase, they learn where the cheese is. And then when you put them back at the start, they actually sort of think through by some kind of forward simulation where they're trying to go. And that's how they figure out how to get the cheese, right? That's at least and Tolman thought there are things they do involving shaking their head and stuff to make them really look like they're thinking, but we'll come back to whether that's a reasonable belief. But in any case, they do have to put together information from here and here. So the other thing is that animals and even people don't always do this, right? People sometimes take actions that are sort of inappropriate to their goals is that they haven't thought through the consequences in the current situation. The sort of habits is the colloquial term for this, and also the psychological terms for this. And there's a claim from a lot of rat experiments that are along these lines, although using lever pressing, that the brain actually contains dissociable choice systems for a sort of deliberative approach to thinking what to do that enables them to solve this problem, and sort of alongside it, a separate sort of simpler model-free system that just contains kind of learned long-run preferences about which actions are the best, and doesn't bother thinking through at each step. So that's sort of where we started with all this, was that perhaps we can think of this dichotomy that had been appealed to in the psychological literature, mostly on rat behavior, in terms of this computational dichotomy between model-based and model-free reinforcement learning. The idea being that maybe rats have in their head both, or even people, this more sort of mental simulation type system and this more sort of habit-like system, this model-free system that learns directly the outcomes of long-run outcomes of actions from behavior, the latter associated with the standard theory of dopamine. One thing this perspective gave us is a way to think about, I think, an underappreciated problem raised by this class of models. So this class of models is sort of really ubiquitous in psychology. It goes back to, to Aristotle, really. People have always thought in these terms. It seems very intuitive. And yet, it's sort of a puzzling, if you sort of think about why would you, evolve a creature to work this way, it's quite puzzling, because having two decision systems doesn't really solve the problem of making decisions. It sort of compounds it, because now you have to choose which one to trust if they disagree. And so one way to pose that question is in terms of what are these two different solutions to the problem of making choices computationally going to do for you in different circumstances. And the basic insight is that they differ in terms of what computer scientists would call sort of computational efficiency, that is how long it takes to come up with a solution, and sample efficiency, that is sort of how good that solution is as a function of the data you have. Or another way of saying that is that it's a sort of cost-benefit, a sort of speed-accuracy trade-off, whereby I can spend a lot of time thinking about what's the right thing to do, and maybe I'll figure out something I hadn't figured out before, like how to get cheese, or I can just act on the basis of what I know. And in some circumstances, it's worth thinking, in some circumstances, it's not. And you can sort of quantify that formally, and arrive at conclusions like, if I, have trained on a task for day after day and it's been stable, it's probably not worth it on day 20 to sort of think through the set of steps again. I should just go ahead and act. Whereas if I'm in a new task, I should really spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's the best action I can do on the basis of my limited experiences. This kind of thinking predicts things like the fact that habits in both animals and people arise with overtraining, right? That you become automatic with practice. And it accounts for a lot of other data as well about, in the rat model, when and when they don't exhibit habits, in terms of this kind of rational meta-decision between these levels. The other thing this sort of perspective has helped us do is give us sort of tools to study these trade-offs in humans, mostly in the laboratory. So we've done a lot of studies now with humans solving sort of trial and error decision tasks that are meant to exercise or distinguish these two systems. So many of them have a structure like the one I'm going to tell you about. So in this kind of task, people make a choice between two, in this case, green Tibetan characters. So there's a series of trials, and each trial they make a choice which leads to another choice. So if they choose the left Tibetan character here, they get pink Tibetan characters. If they had chosen the right one, they get blue ones. And then these second set of choices between pink and blue ones are for money. So I can either get reward or not stochastically, say with 57% probability or with 41% probability, depending on which thing I choose at the bottom. And so my goal is sort of to figure out which actions to choose at the top so as to get the best actions at the bottom so as to have the highest chance to win rewards. And they do all this against a sort of changing probabilities. These underlying rewards are sort of diffusing over time, so they've got to keep learning and keep updating their preferences, and we can study how they learn and change. So one more trick in this version of the task is that the trials could start randomly either with green states or orange states here. So people would face, they'd start the game and they'd, at each trial, and they'd either choose between greens or choose between orange. If they chose the orange, one of them was sort of the cousin to the other one would lead to the pink, and one of them would lead to the blue. So the reason we did this is that the patterns by which subjects learn to choose green or orange options as a function of feedback in the task basically depend on what estimation strategy they're using. And in particular, using two start states dissociates the value of the pink and blue states at the bottom from the experienced rewards following the orange and green states at the top. So if the way I make choices in this task is so-called model-based, right? If what I do is think through the map of the task in my head, by which I mean trying to figure out how good is this one. Well, I think about the pink states, and this one is worth a certain amount. Then feedback, anything I learned about the value of one of these guys is going to tell me not just about the green one, but about its sort of corresponding orange one, even if I learned it following a choice of green. Whereas if I'm model free, if what I'm really doing is just tracking after I choose this green one whether I get reward or not, and I'm not learning about the intermediate states, and that's the sort of simple model free strategy, then if I say choose this one and then choose this one and then get rewarded for it, that will increase my chance of choosing the green one again. I'll learn that it's got its reward, but it won't do anything for the orange ones, right? Because the relationship between the orange ones and the green one is mediated through this model, through the pink states. And if I'm model free, then I just will miss that contingency. Okay, so that's sort of how the task works. One way we can visualize this in data, and just to say what I said again, is we can look at sort of win, stay, lose, shift type behavior at the top level. So whether or not I choose the same green action again on trial t+1 as I chose on trial t, as a function of whether I got reward or not in the previous trial. So in general, if I get rewarded, I should be more likely to repeat the action. But also whether or not I'm actually in the same state as I was. So if I do green and then get something for it, and now I get put in the orange state, or instead I start in the different one, like the orange state. So if I'm model free, then what I've just finished saying is that if I get rewarded following a choice, I'll be more likely to choose the same thing again than if I didn't get rewarded. But if you then switch me over in the next state to the orange state, that information shouldn't carry over at all, right? Can you see my mouse? The feedback after a green choice won't tell me anything about an orange choice. Whereas if I'm model-based, it doesn't matter whether I started in orange or green. If I get rewarded, I'll be more likely to choose the same thing again, and I'll also be more likely to choose its cousin again by the same amount, right? So the patterns of generalization across the two start states are different across these two strategies. And we generally expected that people would have some hope that, given that both these things that are supposedly going on in the brain, that people would exhibit both these patterns, and we tried to sort of tweak this to a regime in which they exhibited both of them, and that's indeed what we saw, and we've seen in many such studies. So for instance, here's a plot of raw data from one particular individual averaged over a couple hundred trials. So at least in the average over those trials, what you see is a very clean kind of model-free pattern, right? They play nice win, stay, lose, shift with respect to one side, as long as you keep giving them that, but none of that information carries over to the other side. There's sort of a chance, right? No matter what the outcome was. Other individuals play sort of perfect model-based, so they have good responsivity to rewards, whether that happens in the same or carries over to a different state. It's just as much of a spread. And lots of people, at least if you average over trials, are somewhere in between. So here's somebody that is strongly driven by reward if you start them in the same state, and part of it carries over to the other state, as though whether across trials or within trials, it's hard to say. They're mixing some influence of this and some partial influence of the other pattern as well. And indeed, if you average over everybody, that's what you see. You see about a 50-50 carryover where they have a good effective reward in the same state, and they carry about half of that over to the different state. And both those effects are significant. which we interpreted, and we can come back to whether this is a good interpretation or not, to reflect a mixture of these two sort of learning processes, at least at the level of the average over subjects, and in some individuals. We can also, just for the purpose of visualizing this, I apologize for the colors, I don't know what I was thinking, but we can plot the sort of effect sizes from a regression that sort of recognizes the extent of this pattern and the extent of the other pattern. So in this case, for the data I just showed you, there's about an even mixture of a model-free effect and a model-based effect. And that's why there's sort of twice as much on the same side. It reflects both contributions. We've used a slight different variant of this in many studies as well, which I won't get into today, but similar logic. Okay, so now I'm not going to dwell on it today, but we've done a lot of work trying to understand, using tasks like this, whether people are trading off two things and how we can see reflections of this trade-off in different circumstances. So for instance, one of the first things we did is my postdoc Ross Otto reasoned that if there really was a sort of trade-off between a more automatic and a more deliberative strategy, then kind of work in human cognitive psychology would suggest that you should be able to selectively interfere with the more deliberative strategy, it being presumably more working memory dependent and so on, using a dual task. So in particular, people played the same game I described before, and in some trials, just like before, you see again that they've got about a 50-50 mixture of model-based and model-free. But on a subset of trials, they were asked to remember a couple of letters and a couple of numbers at the start of the trial. They make the two choices, they get the reward, and they have to answer a question about the things they were holding on to in memory. And in those cases, what we expected was that there would be a sort of a selective interference with model-based learning, and indeed there was. That is, people were still perfectly good at the model-free, but they couldn't generalize in the model-based fashion, right? And these trials are actually kind of within subject, kind of interleaved. 1/3 of the trials are these, and 1/3 of the trial, 2/3 of the trials are these. So this is not, this is a sort of dynamic effect where you can really see a change in people's behavior just by loading their memory. There's just, something's going on here. There really is something you can sort of selectively affect. Later, lots of people, us and others, have used this kind of task and seen lots of different changes, both kind of individual differences over development and aging, and also neural manipulations or disorders and so on, usually involving dopamine and particularly its role in prefrontal cortex, almost all of which seem in this type of task to be sort of loaded on this purple bar going up or down. So people seem to use more or less model-based learning relative to baseline, depending on circumstance and situation. We don't ever see much, and other people haven't seen much variation in the model-free measure, whether that's about the brain and about how it trades things off or about the task, I'm not sure. It may be a deficiency in the task. But in any case, we have a sort of strong readout consistent across a lot of studies now of this type of sort of deliberative strategy and when people use it. Yeah?
People are heard about what they think they were doing. People who use a model-based, seem to use a model-based approach.
So almost anybody can tell you, we interview them, well, so one thing to say is we teach them the structure of the task pretty carefully to make sure they construe it the same way we do. Anybody can sort of tell you that they've learned what comes after what and so on. If you ask people to describe their strategy in this whole type of task, I've never found the things they say to be particularly useful. I mean, they tell you slightly weird stories about thresholds and things they think they're doing that don't seem to be especially, they're sort of hard to formalize and they don't seem to be especially borne out in the data if you do formalize them. So I think it's tough to sort of match up English against, or Hebrew for that matter, even tougher for me, against task behavior. So there isn't necessarily a really obvious mapping there. But again, results like this suggest there's something kind of explicit going on. It's a good question. And the other thing to say maybe is that it's not necessarily the case that this has to be an explicit-implicit distinction, right? That's sort of a classic way of thinking about this thing in psychology, but rats can do this kind of goal-directed planning, right? And presumably they're not reasoning linguistically about it or something. So this is more of an operational distinction than a claim about consciousness or something. Okay, so let me give you one sort of feel, and I'll come back in more detail to this later, how this has helped us look in human neuroimaging studies, at least to see that there are distinct neuromechanisms underlying these apparent strategies. So one way we've done that, and in particular tried to ask the question, are subjects really doing this thing that I said the rats are doing, where they sit at the start of the maze and think forward through the task, right? Is that really how they're solving this problem to the extent they're model-based? And does the extent they're doing that predict, at least across subjects or across trials, how model-based they are? One way to ask that question is to do what we did before, but to replace the Tibetan characters, which are abstract, with particular categories of visual images, with the reason that, as you probably know, in human neuroimaging, there are sort of canonical activations in higher visual cortex that are associated with looking at or even thinking about particular categories of visual images. So by using faces and houses and so on, or faces and places, and training a decoder separately on those classes of images, we can use a multivariate decoding from the brain to read out the extent to which, even though they're sitting here deciding between these guys, they're thinking about body parts or places in this case. That is, can we see a neural correlate of this kind of perspection, right? So if they're looking at faces but thinking about body parts and scenes, that would be a signature of perspection. In particular, we want to ask, can we decode the path they're ultimately going to choose as being higher than the other one? And that gives us a neural measure of the extent to which people are sort of planning in the forward sense at the choice time. So we do indeed have areas associated with those things. That's not a surprise. But what did work and wasn't, foregone conclusion is that this is a cross-subject analysis. We've done sort of similar things across trials within subject. Each dot here is a person, and the x-axis is sort of what I showed you before, an index from their behavior of how model-based or model-free they are. That is, how much they sort of generalized across the different start states. The neural is, the y-axis is the extent to which we can decode where they're going to go from the body part and scene activity. And what we see is that there's indeed a sort of positive correlation where people whose behavior looks more model-based also show more of this perspection. So it seems as though, of course, there's an association. There's a real association between the neural signature and the behavioral signature of how we think it's being done. That is, through this sort of anticipatory activity. Now, that was encouraging, but of course, as was rightly pointed out by peer reviewers, and we also worried about, perhaps we just have kind of good people and bad people. And the people over here have sucky brain activity, and also, their behavior is bad too, right? So these are just people who are asleep or unmotivated or have, their glasses off or something. And that it's nothing really specific to perspection, right? One way to convince ourselves that it wasn't the case is to look at an affirmative signature of what we think is going on the model-free side. So famously, as I mentioned, these sort of reward prediction error signals that have correlates in the dopamine system are associated with model-free learning, and we think that's how the brain updates its evaluations to the extent it's doing model-free learning. In humans, you can see correlates of that signal that look very similar to what sort of the famous monkey midbrain neurons do in ventral striatum, in this case ventral putamen. And so we can ask, again, across subjects, how does this signature, which we think is an affirmative signature of model-free learning, how does this vary across subjects? And what we see is the opposite thing, that the people who might otherwise had worried were sort of asleep have a stronger reward prediction error signal correlating with the extent to which they exhibit the model-free signature in their behavior. And so I think that's what this suggests, is that we don't have good subjects and bad subjects. We really have two different brain mechanisms with different signatures that are differentially engaged in different subjects. And it goes some way to, I think, to supporting the idea that this really is the right way to think about behavior on this task, as engaging these two different mechanisms.
So what are the reaction times for transitions between pictures?
So the choice reaction times at the top level, but at either level, are less than a second. People are quick at this task. There are effects in reaction times. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking. So in some versions of this task, we can surprise people with unexpected results. So I choose this and I end up on the other side instead. And people will slow down if you surprise them suggesting they had some idea where they were expecting to go and sort of pre-planned what they were going to do. And that is another signature of sort of model-based learning. So the extent they do that tracks the extent to which they use in most people, in most populations, tracks the extent they use that in making their choices, right? So it sort of goes together that if they're using it to anticipate, as we also see in the brain activity, they also use that to speed up their reaction times.
And this doesn't cause a bleed through of the volts?
So I didn't tell you, we do this on, we have probe trials where we don't show the second level choice. So actually what I'm showing you on the left here is only trials in which they make a choice between faces and houses, or between two faces, let's say, and then we stop the trial because of the slowness of the volts. And we don't want to mistake actual body parts and scenes for perspection. So that's a good point. I think that's not an issue with this analysis, but.
The reaction time in the basis without manipulating the choice later on, does that correlate also with model free versus model-based?
So that's a long story. Yes. So in the very first study, we didn't, I think the effect was like 0.07 or something. You can do that within trials, across trials within subject, or across subjects within trials. Overall trials across subjects. And I think in the original study, that was true like 0.07 for both of those analyses. In this study, you have the issue that the dual task, you might hope that there's a really nice dissociation, but the dual task sort of confounds that. There's a third trial type on this where we can make a very clean comparison in this study, and we see a nice effect on reaction time in a situation where they're doing less perspection, but there's not an overt interfering task. So maybe that's the best answer. So yeah, so it does seem like there's reaction time correlates of all this. With one additional caveat, some of the versions of this task, there's only one start state, so there's no reason they really have to wait till it comes on to decide what to do. And so that makes it hard to see anything. Indeed, there's evidence separately from eye tracking and stuff that in some circumstances, in some people, they figured out what they're going to do before the trial comes on, so the reaction time doesn't really make any sense. So there's a lot to say about that, but to the extent we can sensibly measure it, I think we see what you're asking about. Okay, good. So we have, some evidence that we see sort of two neural mechanisms here. One reason that people have been interested, I think, in this class of models for a long time, and continue to be interested in, is because they're so compelling, kind of introspectively, for thinking of situations when we might be sort of two minds about something. So people invoke this sort of general class of models to explain racism and moral dilemmas and compulsion and self-control, right? So in particular, sort of the standard sort of back of the envelope theory of what's going on in disorder like drug abuse is that it's associated with some kind of imbalance between deliberative and automatic behavior. The drugs, because they affect dopamine, train up bad habits, and even though people know cognitively that they're destroying their lives, they still do it because it's a sort of habit, it's model-free, and that somehow this is the architecture for that. Right? I think there's a lot of problems with that idea, and there's also, it's tough to study, but we wondered if we could start to get a handle on it using this kind of task. And so the first thing we did was really just give the same task I've just described to you to a bunch of patients with different compulsive disorders. And so Valerie Voon, my collaborator who led this study, through a network of her own collaborators working with different patient groups, sort of gathered up different patient groups with some kind of compulsive problem. Some of you might be co-authors on this paper, for all I know, it's a lot of people. And found that indeed, so this is a composite of all the control groups, and they sort of look similar to what we've seen before. They've got some model-based behavior. They're less on the ball than undergraduates, but they're not bad. But if you look at people with binge eating disorder, which was a DSM-4 disorder involving compulsive eating, meth and cocaine abusers, and also patients with obsessive compulsive disorder. In all these cases, you see a sort of selective decrease in the model-based decision making here, consistent with the idea that across all these compulsive disorders, there's a dimension of imbalance between habitual and deliberative decision making, or something like that, and in particular, sort of impoverished deliberative decision making. So that was, I think, exciting, but of course, there's a lot of ambiguity here. So for instance, there's no patient control group. So you've got a bunch of healthy people and a bunch of sick people, and all the sick people are kind of worse at the model-based learning. So we don't really know this specific to compulsive disorders. It could be, the stress of being a patient or something like that. And indeed, as has often happened, I think, in psychiatry, a bunch of papers then came out from us and others showing the same kind of impairments in all kinds of psychiatric patient groups, including ones like schizophrenia and social anxiety that seem like they don't really have anything to do with compulsion, arguably. So we're sort of like, maybe we don't have a specific signature of anything underlying these disorders, but my brilliant former postdoc, Claire Gillen, said maybe the issue is more a sort of general issue with psychiatry, which is that the definitions of the diseases are basically not right. That you can't really, it doesn't make sense to study patients with schizophrenia versus controls because there's 10 different types of schizophrenia, and almost everybody who's schizophrenic also smokes, and so on. So there's a lot of problems with comorbidity and also heterogeneity in the traditional disease categories. And without getting a handle on that, you're never going to get a clean readout on whether some particular dimension of psychopathology is associated with any particular brain mechanism, let's say.
Don't you also have another, if you go back,
Yeah.
don't you see another, before you had like 50% effect size explained by model-free and 50% explained by model-based. And now, at least in the student users, you're down to 20% that can be explained at all based on model-free or model-based. So you have like a third component that...
So I'm not sure that the units, it's a good question. I don't think the units of these are sort of a regression coefficient, so it's not like an R squared or something. You're right that because it's a regression, these things are it's a logistic regression, there's other versions of it, but where these things are basically trading off against perseveration and noise. So there's certainly other things in the behavior, some of which might be systematic, and some, like making the same choice over and over again, and some of which appear to be just noise. And it is also the case that there are people like this meth abusers who are sort of overall less predictable, and that might also be an interpretational concern, I agree. Nevertheless, I think these effects are sort of large and reliable, and across a lot of studies, we think we're sort of reading something off, even if we can't predict everything about every choice, of course. But I think that's a fair point. People like OCD, there are populations who are really good, and there are populations who are even better. We can come back to that. So it's not just there is a selectivity to it, even in the stimulant abusers, right? It's not just a generalized deficit. There's a selective interaction whereby the model-based seems to be affected. But there's a bigger problem, I think, or another problem, which is the lack of selectivity. So what Claire did to address that was to sort of turn to a completely different style of study, which is to run a gigantic online study of 2,000 people recruited over the web browser, so they could play this game and then take a battery of psychiatric questionnaires in which they self-report symptoms of different disorders. And she sort of chose a set of disorders that were compulsive on the one hand, and a set of more control disorders that are more kind of mood disorders as a sort of control. And then you can ask, this is general population sample now, so you don't have disease, formally diagnosed patients, but given that the incidence of depression is 5 or 10%, you got plenty of sick people in a sample of 2,000 people. We just ask the extent to which your score on these questionnaires predicts, again, the sort of height of this purple bar. And what you see if you just do it questionnaire by questionnaire is kind of the same messy thing. It is true that the strongest effects are on the compulsive disorders, but there's at least a trend in some of their significance even in these mood disorders. They're also trending in the direction of the sicker you are, the less model-based you are. And so it doesn't seem like there's specificity there. But with 2,000 people, you can also really look at the structure of the symptoms better, and you're not forced to kind of use the traditional categories. So this is a correlation matrix across the 200-ish items that they're asked across all these questionnaires. And you see this off-diagonal structure is that there's correlation within the scales, but there's also correlation across the scales, reflecting the sort of comorbidity or relationships across these scales. If you do a factor analysis on that, you can pull out sort of broader dimensions of variations that cut across these different scales. And the best solution in this particular data set is 3 factors, one of which concerns mostly mood disorders, one of which concerns social anxiety mainly, and the second one here is seems to track compulsivity, including binge eating and disturbing thoughts. And interestingly, it sort of cuts across things that come up in the other categories. So it's not sort of unique to the scales for compulsivity, but if you sort of look at the things that load highly, they really do look like either compulsive behaviors or sort of intrusive thoughts. And if you score people on that, now you really see a selective effect that, stronger than any of the individual questionnaires, the extent to which you exhibit this pattern and not these other 2 patterns, it really does predict goal-directedness. So it seems as though there really is a selective effect relating a sort of dimension of psychopathology, once you understand the dimensional structure of it, to this sort of underlying brain mechanism. Okay, the last couple minutes I just want to sort of nod toward a new line of work we've been working on, thinking particularly about the neural substrate for this kind of deliberation. And just to remind you, maybe the best hint we have about how this is really going on is these very suggestive results from rats, where activity in their hippocampus seems to sort of run ahead of them along potential paths, potentially observing this kind of mental simulation of where they want to go, or where they're thinking about going. Okay, so that's a great idea until you start to look into the details. And one of the reasons that it turns out to be puzzling is if you ask the guys who do this, it turns out there's nothing particularly special about this pattern of forward replay that people have made so much of. In fact, in some people's hands, you're much more likely, or certainly in different circumstances, you're much more likely to see other patterns of replay, like backward replay, where instead of rolling forward in front of the animal, the activity kind of rewinds behind him. And you can see it's actually rewinding backwards because in some situations, play cells are unidirectional. And so this has led people to think that either play cells aren't involved in planning, or at least these different patterns of activity are sort of doing different things. And one reason they think that, and in particular, there's also sort of offline replay when they're asleep, or you can also think about activity when animals also think about locations that aren't connected to where they are. My read on this literature is that people have distinct kind of word theories about what each of these patterns of replay does. And one reason they think that is that they arise in different circumstances. So for instance, animals tend to think ahead at the start of a maze and think backwards at the end of a maze, which might make sense, but they think of as being 2 different things. On the other hand, there's also really nothing special, as I maybe hinted before, about this idea of forward planning, right? It doesn't, although everybody kind of thought that what happens is the rat has to make a choice, so he simulates ahead, that's not the only way to figure out the relationship between the cheese and the turn left, right? So for instance, as soon as I find out that the cheese is here, I can think backward and think, how could I have gotten here, right? And I could learn by sort of backward induction already at this point that I could turn left if I'm ever at the start of the maze again to get the cheese, right? And that's a perfectly logical solution. And indeed, there's neuroimaging evidence from studies similar to the one I showed you from Daphne Shohami, suggesting that people really do that in humans. And there are other patterns as well. So for instance, I could, we can give people breaks between learning about rewards and taking a test, and then we can neuroimage them then. And indeed, that kind of reinstatement also during the break, kind of offline, predicts their ability to solve this kind of task. And so I think what that means is that it's not a problem. We've been sort of too narrow in thinking the way people and animals solve this problem is by forward simulation. They can also do it by these other patterns, and indeed these other patterns are exactly what we see in these neurons. So there really is a kind of general function. It's just more general than the particular signature we'd imagined. And so I don't have time to sort of go through the details of it, but we have a sort of recent paper which attempts to use this example of place cell replay in rodents as a sort of window on deliberation and see if we can really understand are the patterns that we see of place cell, non-local place cell activity in different circumstances consistent with or what you would expect from the idea that it's doing this kind of credit assignment, not just forward credit assignment, backward credit assignment, or sort of offline credit assignment as well. But can we understand all of these sequences as occurring in circumstances would it be useful to connect a left turn to its consequences over space and time by activating a series of place cells. And a sort of two-slide sketch of this theory is that we, in a sort of toy model, we imagine that animals order the steps of computation, like which locations they're going to think about, and those locations locally move information about value like cheese from one location to another so as to connect it over space and time, over trajectories. And then they sequence them sort of optimally according to a sort of formal notion of priority that we define from a kind of ideal observer model. In brief, it's got two terms. It's about the value thing about a particular location is partly, am I ever going to be there again? How likely am I to visit that location so I can use that insight to make better choices? And also gain, how much reward am I likely to earn if I think about this particular location versus not, right? So there's a sort of, it's like expected utility is probability times magnitude, right? It's how likely am I to visit the place? What do I gain if I do? And with that sort of simple idea, I will skip the equations this time. We can pretty much explain most of what we know about when place cells replay in what patterns. So for instance, I mentioned that rats tend to replay forward at the start of a maze and backward at the end of the maze. It turns out in our theory we predict the same pattern, and that's not because these are two different things that do different things. They do the same thing. It's just that need promotes thinking about places you're about to go, and that tends to dominate when you're about to decide whether to go somewhere. And gain basically predicts if I've just learned something, like I get to the end of the maze and get food, that tells me something about places nearby that I could have gotten there from. How could I have gotten this food? And that actually wants to drive backward replay. And because these two things are sort of multiplied to produce the utility, they just trade off in this way that you get more forward replay at the start and backward replay at the end because they're driven by these two different imperatives, but for the same function. Another puzzle which this explains is when you get replay and when you don't. So just some surprising events, like unexpected rewards, drive a whole bunch of backward replay in many authors' hands, and some don't. So there's a famous study where rats run back and forth on a shuttle maze. Sometimes they don't get the reward they were expecting to get at the end of the maze. And that's a sort of bad surprise. And in principle, that teaches the animal something that he could propagate backward with backward replay. But in fact, our theory predicts they shouldn't do that because he's going to shuttle anyway. And it doesn't really change his behavior to know there's less reward here than not. So it's sort of not actionable information. But a very similar experiment where there's a shock at the end of the maze so he can decide not to go there, that's now also a kind of bad surprise, but now it's an actionable bad surprise. In that case, you get tons of backward replay. And so this notion inside our theory of gain, our equation for gain, is this distinction that you really want to replay trajectories that will teach you something that changes your behavior, and that's what distinguishes these two seemingly similar circumstances. We can also predict what rats dream about when they sleep on the same principles and lots more. But I think I should wrap up. So let me just say, I hope I've convinced you that how we compute decision variables influences what we choose. So I started by telling you sort of a story about there being two strategies for computing decision variables that underlie this sort of habit goal kind of deliberative conflict between recomputation and retrieving. And this gets us some way to thinking about things like compulsion. And what I sketched at the end, and we have a much more detailed write-up of it, is a much more granular account, not just of whether to think or not, but of about what should we think about and when should we think about it, trying to allocate our computation where it's most beneficial. And so far that's helped us think about activity in rat brains, but I think it will also help us think about choice behavior in humans and rats as well. And I think having this kind of more granular theory ultimately will help us go beyond just thinking about compulsion, like situations where you do stuff you know you shouldn't, to other related circumstances that are harder to explain in that view, like rumination and obsession and craving, which are really affirmative misbehavior. I'm sort of thinking about the wrong stuff, and this gives us a way of thinking about why that might be. So with that, let me just thank the people who did the work, especially Marcelo Matar, did the work I talked about at the end. And again, I'm here for a while, so send me an email, and thanks a lot.